Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight we're going to be entering the wicked and creepy world of witches. Huge thank you and shout out to Christina Darlin, who actually recommended this topic and selected it with the use of a power token, which all of you can obtain if interested by checking out my Patreon page, where you can receive a ton of rewards for signing up. Link in the description. But without further ado, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. This story was told to me by my grandfather and told to him by his friend while he served in the Vietnam War. This is going to be told in the point of view of my grandfather's friend. Before I was drafted, I was working on a farm in Alabama. All my life I've been working on a farm with family and friends. We never had much money, so about 20 of us had to live in an old plantation house. On the property, there was an old barn where we kept the work horses, one mule and a few hogs. Next to the woods were some old slave houses that some of our friends lived in. Every morning as the sun rose, we rose. For breakfast, we ate whatever was for dinner the night before. We didn't have time to sit and wait for food to be cooked. Us kids had to work with the women, so we mostly just picked whatever was being harvested that year. Basically, I'm telling you it was hard work. We always had strange things happen to us. We were pretty much in the middle of nowhere, and the only time we'd see new faces was when we went to town in our wagon to sell our vegetables. We couldn't just call 911 because we didn't have a single telephone. We didn't even have lights. We used candles and lanterns. The little bit of money we had wouldn't pay for electricity. One winter night, we were all settled down after a day of harvesting hay. The men were sitting around the fireplace smoking pipes, chewing tobacco and talking. The women were either talking to each other or reading some of the magazines we had brought from town. Me and the other children were laying in our beds whispering to each other, playing little games while trying not to be heard by the adults downstairs. At about this time of night, one of the men had walked outside to the outhouse, which was behind the main house next to the forest. As he was reaching it, he heard an owl hooting from the trees. He didn't think that was weird. Owls were common. But the thing that made him stop walking was how the owl's hoot changed to a coyote howl. After that, it became a donkey braying, and after that it was a high-pitched whistle. The man yelled into the woods, thinking and hoping it was just someone playing a trick. He walked back into the main house and peed beside the porch, even though the women told him not to do it in the past. He didn't care about what they had to say. He didn't feel right about using the outhouse at that moment. About half an hour later, the dog starts barking. The men shrug it off, thinking it's a deer or something, but the barking got worse. It almost sounded like the dog was barking at an intruder. And then, just as suddenly, the dog stopped barking. The men knew something was up. So did the women. So a few of them went outside to check on the dog. When they found the dog behind the barn, its belly was ripped open, and its tongue appeared to have been bitten off. They knew a coyote didn't do this, nor a bobcat. One of the men picked up the corpse of the dog, and they all walked back to the main house to get a rifle and bury it. As they were burying the dog, the horses inside the barn started raising hell. The men knew whatever it was that killed the dog was now after the horses, so they ran into the barn and ripped open the door. They calmed the horses and searched the barn for the animal, and as they were searching, one of the men pointed that all of the horses' tails were braided. At about the time he pointed this out, they heard footsteps in the hayloft. Two of the men rushed to climb the ladder. But when they got to the top, they found no one. Everyone knew what had visited the farm that night. It is known for witches to braid the tails of horses. It is known for them to make weird sounds to draw in their prey. It's a story that I'll never forget. It's something that will always make my skin crawl. About 9 years ago, my dad's side of the family was talking about how they would hear and see witches in their younger days. My grandfather started to explain on how his father would see ladies at night walking towards this small lake in the outskirts of town, and they all carried a cat each, which he pointed out that cats didn't seem to have eyes, so it was rare to see these ladies. He said this was mostly at 2 to 3 a.m, because at 5 a.m, he would go to wash his clothes as the small lake was connected to the other water source, and the ladies would always seem to leave about 5 a.m. when he and the other people would show up. Even my grandma had encountered them, and I'm not sure because she sadly passed away before my dad turned 5. But I know that my grandfather said she would always be scared of them because they had long nails and wore hoods. Not only this, small kids would always end up with bite marks. Full moon days were the worst, as it seemed like there was smoke at the lake, and somehow it made people afraid to go early. He did say something about trying to go into and do some witch hunts, but oddly enough, the guy that he was going to do it with never appeared. This guy's disappearance connected to him talking later on some treasure that the ladies had given him to leave them alone. 2 others had gone with him, but only one showed up, and he had gone mad. I couldn't speak anymore, just scream. He'd been traumatized by something, and he died in hospital days later. Many years later, the infrastructure in the area became more prevalent, and the sightings of those ladies vanished. There are mountains that are said to be the home of their new location, although it's more common than the city folk believe in them less, as the rural areas are where they seem to congregate. Earlier this year during the spring, my wife had planned a trip with an older woman who she befriended. They had been friends even before I first met my wife. She had mentioned to me before that her friend was a witch and routinely performed rituals with animal limbs. I don't know anything about witches, to be honest, but what I experienced leads me to believe that she's bad news. I've yet to meet her in person, but strange things have happened after she visited our apartment. My wife's friend drove to our apartment early one Thursday morning so that they could carpool to their destination. I work during the afternoon and into the night, so her knocking woke me up. My wife was already awake and greeted her at the door. They had a brief conversation in the living room and were on their way. After they left, I had a hard time returning to sleep, so I tried to kill some time on my phone. It was just after 9 a.m. when I felt some unusual vibrations underneath my bed. I was confused at first and thought I was experiencing an earthquake. The vibration then turned into what I can only describe as someone kicking my mattress from underneath it. I sat up in bed and carefully observed other objects in the room to see if they were also shaking and to see if this really was an earthquake. Nothing else in the room was affected. No later than 10 seconds after sitting up, I felt my king-sized mattress come up off the bed frame about 2 to 3 inches and lightly lean from left to right. After that, the mattress settled back on the frame. My body became unusually warm, and I was too scared to jump out of bed, fearing something would grab my ankles as soon as I touched the floor. This happened in my childhood and teen years, back when I was living in Venezuela. I am now 29 years old and living in the United Kingdom. My parents are originally from Portugal, but immigrated to Venezuela looking for a better life. We lived in a massive apartment complex with over 30 different apartments. My mum was close friends with a couple of neighbors from the ground floor as we lived on the third. These two neighbors were brother and sister. The brother lived alone with a husky, while the sister lived with her two sons who were really good friends of mine. Now it's important to point out that the sister was a divorced mum, whose ex-partner was a very wealthy truck company owner. She had everything paid for by her ex-partner, from the apartment she lived in to daily groceries and anything she needed. After all, she was bringing up his two sons. Now, ever since I can remember, my mum and the sister would always light-heartedly joke about a ghostly apparition they named Francisco. I must preface by saying that I have neither recollection or don't think I ever have seen Francisco myself, but recall them saying he was a smartly dressed man with a moustache that was always seen walking around the apartment complex. I recall multiple times where my mum and or sister would point out that they could see Francisco, and I was not able to see him myself. Now, Francisco appeared to be a friendly ghost, and was never threatening to anyone. However, Francisco's presence was mainly felt in the brother's apartment, who lived right next to his sister. The brother always used to joke that he and Francisco were roommates and never felt threatened by him. He used to tell us that at night he could hear Francisco running around the house, opening closets and cabinet doors, and that he was so active that he would yell at him to shut up and take a shower and watch TV. He would then either hear all the taps in the bathroom open and or the TV turning on. Multiple times throughout my childhood, I recalled playing with their sons in the corridor and hearing loud noises coming from the brother's apartment when there was no one there. Whether that be furniture clashing, doors opening and shutting, to loud sounds of glass and plates being smashed. Most of the time, we would inform the sister who would check the apartment and confirm that everything was fine. This continued for a few years, with nothing major to mention apart from the above. Suddenly, the activity began to increase, with a lot more apparitions and the brother mentioning that Francisco was a lot more restless and active than usual. His own husky would cower in the corner when in the house, terrified of being alone. And this is the first time weird things started to happen. The sister would be involved in a massive car crash, where she was lucky to come out alive. The eldest of her sons fell down a huge flight of stairs, breaking his leg and cracking a few ribs. And finally, her mum came to visit her and her sons for a few days. She was around 50 years old and healthy. One evening, while sitting at home with her daughter and grandsons, she had a sudden heart attack and passed away. This shocked everyone, as she had no reports of heart issues and had been completely fine up until that moment. Things went back to normal in the following weeks. Shortly after that, my parents decided to move to another city, and I completely forgot about Francisco and the things that happened. Years later, the sister and brother also moved out, but something surprising happened. It was common knowledge that Francisco lived with her brother, or at least that's where he was most active. But Francisco tagged along following the move. He went with the sister rather than the brother. Now, most of this has been told to me by my mum, as she kept in close contact with the sister. But from what she remembers, it's that following the move, Francisco started going absolutely crazy in the new house. From cabinet doors and shelves opening and closing frantically, to objects being thrown around the house. The sister had been harmed a few times by scratches along her back, and almost every night the duvet would be pulled off while she slept. It got to the point where the sister and her sons would sleep in the same bedroom and pray every night for it to stop. One day, deciding that they couldn't live like this anymore, a priest was brought into the house and did a blessing. Immediately following the blessing of the house, her kitchen caught fire, but thankfully it was contained to just that area. The cause of the fire was determined to be a candle that was lighted to a cross of Jesus Christ. Now, the only way this would have caused a fire was if someone would have tipped it over intentionally. However, there was no one home and the windows were closed, so this was obviously blamed on Francisco. Around the same time, her youngest son was caught in a crossfire between the police and local gang, but he managed to get away from it unscathed. Following this, the sister and her ex-partner decided to speak with a local witch who dealt with white magic. The witch came to the house and immediately began to speak with Francisco out loud. It turns out the reason he was smartly dressed was because he was a dentist when alive and always liked to keep up appearances. He also died young, was buried at 30, and apparently someone had performed black magic using the earth from his grave and brought him back to the world of the living with one task: take one life with him every 10 years. The first life he took was the grandmother 10 years earlier, and it was coming up to the 20-year mark. It was the reason he was a lot more active and the weird things started happening again. But above all, he wanted to rest in peace. The witch managed to contain him to a jar and take him with her, with the promise he will have a proper burial and will be able to rest in peace. He was apparently temporarily released in her backyard, which he went absolutely crazy on, smashing things and breaking windows before being buried and put to rest. Now, it has been theorized by my mum and the sister that this could have only been done by the new wife of the sister's ex-partner. She hated the sister and her sons because they were living off her husband and both had multiple raging arguments, cursing each other and wishing death on the other. The sister believes the new wife must have spread the cursed dirt on one of her pot plants when she came to visit with her ex-partner. It's a long story, but one I always use when someone claims to not believe in the paranormal. I love having my mum tell the story and seeing the look on their face. I work with a guy from Mexico, and he used to tell me crazy stories about the country. The one that scares me the most is the one about the white dress witch. While in Mexico, he said every year, once a year around 3 a.m, he would wake up and in the corner of his room he would see a lady in white. He would be so freaked out that he couldn't do anything except stare and cry at her. So after he told me that, I told him, yeah, right. Then he told me he saw her in the back of our chemical plant on graveyards at 3 a.m. Again, I shook it off until I had to go back there and mess with some dryers. As I was walking back, I look back and I see white sheets flowing in the wind. So I stopped, and that's when I realized it was a lady in a dress with white hair. I didn't think I'd ever run so fast in my entire life. Of course, when I got back to the shift, I told them what I saw, and no one believed me except my friend from Mexico. Ever since then, I've been seeing more and more weird and unusual things in the plant, and now my home. My grandfather used to be the equivalent of a ranger down in Mexico. He was in charge of patrolling the farms and lands, mainly due to people growing weed. One day he said he was patrolling this ranch late at night, during the night shift, and he heard a baby crying. Now the land is pretty flat, so he looks everywhere and saw nothing. Maybe it was some goats out in the distance. They sound like crying babies sometimes, and as he's walking his route he hears the same sound. looks up in the sky, and he swears he saw a witch, with black clothes and everything, flying towards a mountain. He panicked, ran to his car, and drove off as fast as he could. Personally, I don't believe him, and my family thought he was high. Ever since my childhood, it has been the family knowledge and joke, or inside secret, that there is a ghost of a witch living in my maternal grandmother's upstairs level. My older cousin, who is now in her 30s, claims she remembers seeing the ghost of the witch as a child, and from then on, even to this day, is still petrified of the stairwell and will not go up it for any reason. My slightly older cousin, who is now 20, says she has been terrified with the stories of seeing the witch for years, but she, like myself, was slightly more curious about it. A few years younger, I was raised with the same tales. She and I used to climb the stairs at night with all the lights out in hopes of being able to confront the ghost witch. It had all started with my grandmother sometime in the 80s. My grandmother, my mother and her siblings, and my late grandfather moved into this 2-story house in the early 80s. The house was under new construction when they purchased the house. My mother often boasts about how she was the one who picked the house. She was a child at the time, and she thought the unfinished house was beautiful. My grandmother and grandfather considered her opinion and gave it a look and ended up purchasing it. My grandmother has always been a person who believes in the paranormal. In her younger days, she played around with stuff like tarot and Ouija boards, but was never avid about it, just light stuff. Her interest in such things, though, spawned from learning about the heritage of the females in our family. They had been witches killed during the Salem witch trials. In fact, one of the very last witch hangings was held about 5 minutes from my current home. My grandmother's mother was always accused by the whole family of being a witch. This accusation may have had something to do with the fact that she was heavily abusive to my grandmother when she was young, fed her rat poison, beat the crap out of her on her wedding night, and constantly emotionally abused her. It has always been believed that her house was cursed. I only met this wicked woman about 3 times, and there was always something off about her. She could convince you that she was the sweetest old woman in the world, and hide how she abused her daughter and her husband. Naturally, when my grandmother found out we were descendants from witches, she considered the possibility of her mother being one more seriously. My grandmother moved her Ouija board and her tarot cards and her books about ghosts into the new house in the 80s, and only after a year or so did strange things begin to happen. My mother and grandmother both remember the first occasion of something strange. My grandmother was carrying a laundry basket up the stairs, and suddenly she could no longer continue up. She said that it was feeling like someone was standing in front of her, forceful as a wall and not allowing her to continue. She physically could not continue up the stairs, and she said that the force felt cold and hot at the same time. My mother says she remembers my grandmother trying her hardest to push against it, but not being allowed through. My grandmother calmly said, "All right, let me through," and the force disappeared. It terrified my mother, and she said it was chilling how calm my grandmother was about it. My grandmother would often have her girlfriends over for tea at her house, as it's rather large, with 2 living rooms and decorative old-fashioned charm. It's similar to a small mansion, and she has quite a collection of tea and antique pots and cups. One tea party in the afternoon, though, would be the first visual sighting of the ghost of the witch. She was having tea with a few of her friends, all ladies, when one of the ladies looked up and over to my grandmother's shoulder. She smiled at something behind her and returned her eyes to my grandmother and asked, "Who's your other guest? I've never met her." My grandmother thought someone else had showed up, but she'd not invited anyone else. She turned around and saw that nothing was there. Her friends then began convincing my grandmother that they weren't crazy. They'd all seen her and described her as an old lady, with long, wavy grey hair that's messy, in a dirty dress with the saddest, most confused-looking expression on her face. Though she found it quite interesting, and she did believe her friends, she remained calm about this experience as well. Those girlfriends of hers suddenly no wanted to come over to her house anymore. My grandfather passed away, and several years later my grandmother remarried. Neither of them ever experienced anything or felt off in the house. None of the men who ever entered the house felt or saw anything at all, and some of the men are skeptics and some are believers, but regardless, none of them saw anything. It seemed the ghost of the witch would only present herself to the women of family or women visitors. Given our heritage, it would make sense. My grandmother, who is still haunted by this ghost witch, has never had an explanation as to why everyone began regarding her as the witch. She simply said that she felt the lady was a witch. My oldest cousin, the one who is now 30, was the second one to visually see this ghostly lady. She was a teenager when she saw it, about to be 20. She was alone in the house on Christmas night, while everyone sat outside in the large garage. The family often sat out there when they smoked and spent hours in there. My cousin claimed that she was going up the stairs to use the bathroom, too embarrassed to use the one on the second floor. She didn't feel like turning the light on, and just carefully walked up, guided by the light of the downstairs Christmas tree. It was then that she said she saw an old woman with a sorrowful expression and long wavy grey hair walk slowly past her at the top of the stairs. She walked her way into the computer room, which was once my mother's bedroom. It's currently, and was when my cousin had her experience, a room full of mirrors and antiques, and my great-grandmother's belongings. My cousin said the old lady walked to that room and she refused to climb the stairs to investigate. She ran out of the house, crying to her father that there was a ghost. He didn't believe her and laughed it off. She was plagued with nightmares for the longest time and currently refuses to go anywhere near the stairwell. After these occasions with the witch, she became a household name, and my older cousin and I were raised on the spooky tales. This was one of the many things that has embedded a fascination with the paranormal and the morbid into my mind from a young age. My grandmother would tell only the young ladies of the house these stories, as the men thought she was crazy regardless of their beliefs on the paranormal, simply because they had never seen anything in the house. My grandmother told my older cousin and I the story of the night that one of her taxidermied birds came back to life for a few minutes. My grandmother and her new husband were both avid hunters and went duck hunting often, as well as fishing in ponds at nighttime. They had their best catch stuffed by a taxidermist and placed in a glass box. The stuffed bird sat atop in a cabin in the computer room, the one the witch apparently walked to. She said that she and her husband were asleep one night when they were startled awake by a loud sound. The sound was of hundreds of birds chirping and screeching and flying. They thought that some birds had hatched in their attic and gotten stuck inside, so that was the first place she checked. Nothing was inside. Though not a single bird, the sound continued, and it seemed to be coming from no specific place. She couldn't locate the sound, so she went to open the computer room door, and when she did, deafening silence fell all over the house, and not a single chirp could be heard. She found the taxidermy bird on the floor, the glass box busted into tiny crystals on the floor. This story and the infamous witch story led my curious cousin and I to venture into the computer room as many times as we could. My oldest cousin called us crazy, but we were curious and brave. We only liked to go up at night, because it created a better ambience and we felt like we had a better chance of seeing something terrifying for ourselves. We played with antique mirrors, dug through old wooden trunks in search of my grandmother's Ouija board, and did ghost chants and witch spells that we found online. When that got boring and came with no results, we got on Microsoft Word and wrote murder mystery stories. We'd write the most gore-filled story we could imagine, and then print it out on my grandmother's printer and hide several copies of it around the house to creep people out. Sometimes the very old desktop computer would take control of itself and start searching for things on its own. We witnessed it type in a series of confusing codes and numbers and then pull up various pictures of headstones and scroll quickly through them. We didn't scream and run out, as our oldest cousin would have. We simply watched in silence, the computer abruptly shutting off, and our only fear was that we would get in trouble for breaking my grandmother's computer. The lights would turn on and off in the room, not as if flickering though. They turned off and on dutifully, as if someone was doing it on purpose. Strange sounds came from the floor, like scratching and bumping, and the mirror always seemed to be in a different spot every time we turned around to look at it. Books fell off shelves, and the other, newer computer kept on the other side of the room would fire up by itself. Before my older cousin and I could ever really delve into the witch story, she grew up. She was only a few years older than me, but her interest turned to boys and being popular in school. She had her first slide phone and stopped paying me any attention at all. We'd once been so close, but her own social standards forced us apart, and she rarely spoke to me. She was rarely mean to me, but she acknowledged me only on holidays. She evolved into a preppy popular girl while I spiraled into a paranormal-obsessed young teenager who scoured the internet for gore and the supernatural. And I still ventured on my own now, into that computer room upstairs. My fascination for the paranormal was far deeper than that of my cousins. Hers had just been a phase. Mine has been my entire life. Both sides of my family believe in ghosts, and each have stories of their own experiences. The only skeptic, surprisingly, is my mother. She does admit, though, that she only doesn't believe because she tries not to, because she's scared to. My father, on the other hand, was my biggest supplier of creepy stories, and he always told me, if you go looking for something, you'll find it sooner or later. Because he knew how badly I wanted to explore ghosts, so I never stopped looking in my grandmother's house. My great-grandmother, nearly 102 years old at the time, was placed in a nursing home because her house couldn't be afforded and all the money was going into the nursing home and the house to the state. There was an occasion where the family was invited to go collect some things from her house, anything that we liked, because they were going to get thrown away. I went and took some creepy old dolls from the 20s, and my mother took some sentimental items. When I was in my great-grandmother's bedroom alone, staring into the large Victorian mirror of hers, chills rushed through me, and I leaped when I saw a shadow dart behind me. I turned around and searched for what had made the shadow, but a strong smell of garlic and burning wood dazzled me and forced me to leave the room. The presence felt sad and angry at the same time. My aunt, who had more business knowledge than any of us at the time, was helping my grandmother close the probate on the house. It was her job to keep the house in good condition, so she had to visit it alone frequently. On the last day of having to go inside, she went in to take the items that she wanted from the estate, a vintage lamp that reminded her of her 70s childhood. She took the lamp and bid the house an relieved farewell. She locked it up behind her, and suddenly a massive bolt of lightning struck the yard just in front of her. The rain began to pour and the wind began to howl, blackened clouds bruising the sky above her, making a great rage of a storm. She quickly tried to unlock the house, but the keys seemed to not even fit the doorknob anymore. The door opened on its own accord after she pulled the key away, and she ran inside to shelter from the rain and sat the lamp down. She claims she saw something run through the kitchen from the corner of her eye, and with the witch rumors about her wicked grandmother, decided to leave the lamp. She closed the door behind her, leaving the lamp, and when she stepped out onto the front porch, the rain had stopped, and there wasn't even a breeze, not a cloud in the sky. She still claims to this day that her grandmother's house was cursed. A few years later, my great-grandmother died. I attended the funeral, and my family made jokes the whole time. My grandmother was hardly sad that this day had come, as she had had to take care of the wicked woman who abused her, and she took care of her about everything she needed every day from her 70th birthday until her death at 102. She was relieved, and when the funeral home workers apologized and gave condolences, we all looked at each other. My aunt, stepping out of the restroom while the big ivory casket was being rolled into the chapel, accidentally whacked it with the door and nearly knocked it over, killing us all as we struggled not to burst into laughter. It was the most humorous funeral we'd ever attended. After her death, my grandmother was plagued with nightmares of her mother coming back to haunt her, or being trapped with her in the afterlife. One night, she found her husband walking around the house, shotgun in hand. She asked him what he was doing, and he looked terrified. This was the first occasion when a man in the house had experienced something paranormal. He was shaking, and he shouted to my grandmother, "Your mother is here." She begged him to explain what he was talking about, and he said, "I smell her. I feel her. She's here, don't you smell that?" Her mother had always worn the same perfume, Elizabeth Taylor's White Diamonds. It was the only perfume she'd ever worn, and she spritzed it on herself heavily every day, sometimes twice a day. It was a scent that had sickened my grandmother's husband for the whole time he'd known the old lady. My grandmother recently tried to give us some of her mother's old jewelry, because she wanted it out of the house so badly. She claimed it was cursed, and I believed her. My aunt certainly believed her, and my older cousin, though so long separated from our experiences as a child, refused to take the jewelry. I thought of taking it, but I already owned a piece of jewelry that was passed down through the women of our family through all the witches. It's a sapphire ring that saw several generations, and for some reason I find that more coincidental that it ended up with me. After my great-grandmother gave it to my grandmother, she gave it to my mother before I was born and said, "Give this to her." My mother didn't even know she was having a girl yet, and she asked her mother how she could assume I was a girl, and my grandmother simply said, "Just give this to her." And, well, here I am, a very paranormal type of girl wearing the witchy sapphire ring today. I haven't seen my older cousin in several years. The last time I saw her was at someone's funeral. She's a drug addict, and she moved far away. My older cousin got married and moved away and hasn't given the paranormal a second thought. It seems now that her memories have been completely erased when the topic of the witch in the computer room are brought up. It's as if she's a different person. My grandmother's friends never came around anymore, and whether they admit it or not, it's because of that ghostly witch. My mother thinks that my grandmother and I are crazy, but it seems we simply are more sensitive to these types of things. Recently, my grandmother said that she was in a store when a short, polite old woman approached her. She was in all white robes and she was shockingly pale, but she was friendly and exuded calm and happiness. She asked my grandmother to direct her to the exit, and she couldn't find it. When she was about to tell her where the exit was, the glowing white woman disappeared into thin air. Nobody believes me but her. I now have my own Ouija board, tarot cards, crystals, mirrors, and antique objects and dolls, as well as a dowsing rod, EMF meter, and EVP reader. For about 3 years I've obsessively tried to contact one particular ghost, and it wouldn't surprise me if I opened the doors to something else in the meantime, especially when considering the lengths I've gone to. I still try to contact this particular ghost, and for now, he only reaches out to me in my dreams. But if you go looking for long enough, I'm sure you're bound to find something. Summer of 2017 is when I witnessed firsthand something dark. Me and my boyfriend at the time had a friend called Ashley that we would visit a lot. She lived in a large apartment building on the second floor. She also mentioned her downstairs neighbor a few times to us. She was kind of creeped out by the lady who lived there, since she never once saw her leave her apartment within the 6 months she already resided there, and had no idea what she even looked like. She had a sign on her door that stated, "Protected by witchcraft," and had tiny mirrors hanging in all her windows, with the reflection sides facing outwards. She told us that she always heard birds screaming in the middle of the night, daily nearly. Curious about all this, we decided to go downstairs to take a peek at the sign on her door. My ex then informed me that he had an extremely bad vibe as soon as we stepped into the hallway, and couldn't stay another minute in that building. It wasn't until the maintenance men went into the apartment that we realized we were not wrong or crazy for being nervous and slightly afraid of this woman. 2 men were making their rounds to each unit, providing everyone with fresh light bulbs. When the men get to Ashley's apartment, one of them looked ghostly white from fear and had told her that when they entered the apartment below, they instantly felt an evil presence within. The woman had painted her walls black and added red symbols all around, including the floor and ceiling. She didn't have any furniture besides a mantle surrounded by candles, and had a room that was chained up that she refused to let them go into. This room had a window that happened to be right next to the front entrance, so there's no avoiding having to walk by it if you wanted to get inside. One night, we decided to pay Ashley a visit in the middle of the night. I had an urge to take a picture of the windows with the mirrors, so I could prove I wasn't lying when I told the story about her. As we walked to the front entrance, we both noticed right away that the light was on in the mysteriously locked room. While waiting for Ashley to let us into the building, all that I could hear was the sound of a screaming bird. If I took a guess, I'd say it was a crow, but I have never in my life heard any kind of birds making that noise. I went to double check the time and saw that it was 3:30 a.m. Being freaked out by this resulted in us cutting our visit short and not visiting her as often anymore. On our way home, I looked at the picture I took. While analyzing, I noticed that every window mirror was gleaming off the streetlights except for one. Instead, the first window to the left looked to be a distorted face peering out a bit, and seemed like it was created by smoke. This made me feel extremely uneasy every time we went back. I couldn't help but feel like that woman was a danger to us all, and everyone who lived nearby. I'm just happy Ashley no longer lives there, and I don't have to be afraid of being cursed anymore. Let me give you a bit of background. I am an 18-year-old male. I'm 5'10" and not the biggest guy, and have been seeing and hearing things since I was 6. This story takes place in the 4th house I lived in, as we're currently on my 5th, and was where the activity really picked up and actually scared me half to death. To the best of my recollection, my first accounts of the paranormal was when I was 6 years old. I heard footsteps around me when I would be in the basement, and then something had grabbed a pile of papers of my drawings off my dresser in my room and thrown them against the adjacent wall. It didn't help that my aunt had a dark entity in her basement who took the form of a large, imposing man. I personally never saw him, but my cousins did. We can't stand to be down there for longer than a minute, and would sprint up the stairs. This all took place in my second house, then in my third, when I was 12 or so. Visual phenomenon started to occur. It was here where I saw doors open and close, shadow figures on two occasion, and an apparition of a tall and lanky male in a striped shirt and jeans out of the corner of my eye. After that, the occurrences stopped for years. I thought I wouldn't see anything again, but I have never been so wrong in all my life. It was about 2 years after I moved to my third house in 2017. I was 17 at the time and had an unfinished basement with concrete floors and no drywall and a completely open area. There were 3 light bulbs in this basement. The shape of the basement was almost a deformed O shape, and the lights were placed at the ends of the U and one end in the middle. So whenever I went to work out in the basement, only the light bulb in the space in front of me, one of the other ends, would start to flicker and flash, sometimes fast, other times not. It would only happen when I stepped onto the treadmill and would keep going till I stopped completely off, even if the treadmill was off. Then I would occasionally see a shadow in that space when I'm not moving. This shadow would peek its head up from some boxes and then duck back after I noticed. My cats would also look over at a space and as if someone was standing there. However, these lights were the occurrences that led up to what would be happening later. It was a Sunday night in summer at about 1 a.m. I was watching comedy YouTube videos and working on a piece of digital art. Out of habit, and so I can hear my family if they call me whenever, I have my headphones off one ear and it was dead silent. My cats were with me at the time, both being asleep next to me. It was a little while after that I heard a blood-curdling scream, as if a murder had just occurred downstairs. Only a few seconds after the scream and taking my headphones off, did I hear a woman's voice. To my best recollection, the voice of the woman was corresponding to the scream and said, "Why are you screaming?" So I'm practically floored and had to investigate. I walk out of my bedroom and down the hall to the loft area and staircase. At first I had tried to rationalize that maybe my sister had a nightmare, and my mum woke up and checked on her. So I checked her room, which was upstairs, and lo and behold, my little sister was asleep in bed, having passed out while watching makeup tutorials. Officially creeped out, I head to the stairs and lean over the railings, and I'm met with complete and utter darkness. There were no lights, no glow from the TV, and at this point I am just a mix of confused and concerned, but will myself go back to my room. So I settled down in bed and continued on the commission I was on, but this time I kept my headphones off and worked in silence, my senses on high alert. It was about 15 minutes or so before the activity continued. Surprisingly loud footsteps started up the carpeted stairs and up to the loft area. It was then, I'm pretty sure at that point I had paled a few shades, and a male voice sounded from the loft, and I can tell it wasn't my dad and surely wasn't me. So I got into protective mode since, unlike my room, my little sister's room was accessible from the loft, so I grabbed the only weapon I had in the room, a switchblade, as I thought it was possible an intruder could be in the house. I texted one of my exes, as we're still friends, who was still awake in the group chat we had. I told him what was going on, and that if I didn't answer in a certain time frame saying it was okay, to call the police. So I searched the house and couldn't find anyone. I looked on all levels of the house and looked to see if there was a car outside, if the doors were open and a window cracked. There were no signs of intrusion. These events were only the starting point of what was to come. So as the months passed, there was the usual flickering and shadow in the basement. But I figured the light was just a wiring issue and was logical. That was until it started answering questions. I was messing around once after I was working out and was like, fine, if someone is there, make the lights flicker twice. And it did, on command. I never asked more questions. I didn't want to get involved with whatever that thing was. However, it kept going on, and I heard footsteps on several occasions in the hall. A shadow figure came up behind me, another scream, and something touched my hand at one point. So much activity was occurring that I kept a journal on my phone of the time and days of these occurrences to see if I was going crazy or not. After about a month, I was pissed off and started bad-mouthing whatever it was when I was in the basement and instantly regretted it. As soon as the final word escaped my lips, I felt an immense burning sensation on my hip under my clothing. I pulled my clothing away and was greeted by a scratch running about 5 inches, starting at my hip and ending just above my mid-thigh. Then about 2 days later at 1 a.m., I was sleeping in my room and heard the papers of my desk start rustling and moving around as if someone were going through my stuff. My first instinct is that my kitten, who is extremely mischievous, was there. The thing was, there wasn't anyone there. I roll over onto my stomach and look at my tomcat, who's on the bed with me. He's looking wide-eyed behind me and starts to puff up like those Halloween decorations, a large growl in his throat. I was about to speak to him when I feel what felt like 2 hands on my shoulder blades and a pressure on my lower back like when someone sits on you. It felt as if one of my friends was sitting on me after we tussled. At first I thought, am I experiencing sleep paralysis? I've never had sleep paralysis, but my mum has. And that was when I realized that I was awake and able to move. Instinctively, I start trying to thrash around and get whatever is on top of me off. Whatever it was wouldn't let up off my stomach, so I was swinging my arms behind me. When my arms struck the area above my back, I felt an immense cold as if I had plunged my arm into an ice bath. However, this somehow got whatever it was off me, and I instantly flipped myself over to sit up and look around at nothing. It was at this time that my cat started to calm down again, but neither of us fell back asleep that night. It was later on in the day where I felt the same burning sensation a few days prior on my other hip, and an almost complete cut was on my leg. It was completely incidental in placement and length as the previous one, but this time whatever did it drew blood, and this time I had enough and took every kind of measure I could to keep this thing at bay. Luckily this stopped as we moved out 2 months later or so. Whatever it was didn't follow me to my new house, and I have been able to live 2 years without these experiences and be at peace. However, there are times where I wonder what that thing was and wonder what it wanted. Did it only ever want to hurt? Was it trying to do something else? I don't know, and even if this was only curiosity, I don't want to find out. From what I've heard, a new family lives there, and now I wonder if they have experienced anything like I had. After some research, I think the figure, or the entity, could be called a night hag. It's a spirit that forces you down in some cases of sleep paralysis. I learnt of the figure of speech from my grandfather, on my mother's side, as he has a similar experience and he would claim that there would be a witch on his back. I later found out from my mother that it's a saying mostly from the African American community, even if this is a global phenomenon, that there is a witch on your back. In my family's case, it is from the folklore in Africa. I don't know which area yet. I'm not sure if it was a witch, but it sure as hell scared the crap out of me, and I still can't explain what happened to me. While visiting my family in the island of Lombok, Indonesia, I heard of what I believe to be known as a witch called Leuk fall from the sky onto the roof. I have lived in Australia my whole life, but my dad, who is from Indonesia, has family over there. 3 years ago, I, along with my mum, dad and sister, was staying with my dad's family, and something creepy happened. We were sleeping in a back room of my uncle's deli under a corrugated iron ceiling. The room was small and only had one small window, which was just a square cut out, with 4 or 5 metal rods in it, like you imagine a jail cell would have. The window had a small curtain over it. In the middle of the night, my whole family and I suddenly awoke to an extremely loud bang on our roof, followed by scratching. The sound was too loud to be created by something as large as a dog or cat. There were no trees for an animal to jump or fall from, and my mum, who has never experienced anything paranormal living in Australia her whole life, became a little worried. Even she was suspecting something otherworldly. My dad wasn't surprised though. He told me many stories of the supernatural while he lived in Indonesia. The next morning, my dad told his brother and sister about what happened. They weren't surprised. They told him that recently, almost every night, Liaks have been running around on people's roofs. They described them as humans with crow-like wings, running, flying, and screaming. Pretty much next to my uncle's deli in our land, there is a village which has their own culture and beliefs. My other uncle married a woman from that village, so our family are quite close with the people. In that village, there is a shaman and a man and woman called Dukun. They're an old couple, and the villagers always go to them with a problem regarding spirits or the supernatural. The wife is a small old lady whose teeth are stained a reddish black due to chewing on betel nuts all day long. The husband, I can't remember his appearance. My family visited them once because they wanted to perform some type of ritual with us, perhaps a cleansing or something. My dad told me the Dukun suspected that there were a few Liaks in the area. A lady and her mother lived in the house next door to my uncle's deli, and they were the ones who were suspected. They thought it was best that they just keep it to themselves and not accuse the ladies of something like this. The creepy thing is, the neighbor's house was next to our room, right where the small window was. In the few nights that I stayed there, I was sleeping right next to the window, and I had a terrible night's sleep. I woke up with a very bad heat rash and was very uncomfortable. My dad told me that several times in the night, he noticed the curtain on the window open, and even though he kept closing it, he had a strange feeling that someone was looking in. After a bit of information about these Liaks, we were told that they're humans who practice in black magic, causing them to turn into supernatural beings. In each region of Indonesia, there are different types of creatures like this with different names and appearances. But in Bali and Lombok, it is known as Leak. During the day they appear as normal human, but at night they leave the house and do whatever they wish. I have experienced many more stories from my dad, and they are all quite haunting. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I do hope that you enjoyed tonight's encounters with the witches. If you did, be sure to let me know down below. If there's a story you'd like to share, feel free to share it to my email or my Reddit page. I'd also like to give a huge thank you to all my incredible patrons for signing up to Patreon and having their names on screen. Your help really does mean the world to me, and it really helps me out a bunch when it comes to creating content. Also, something quite terrible is happening right now. Now, for those of you who don't know, as I'm trying to piece this together, the FTC, the American, Federal Trade Commission, is basically trying to, harm creators inadvertently. It's a very long and complicated thing, but essentially they are asking each individual creator to say whether their channel, each video that they create might be appealable. Can you say that? Appealable? Might appeal to children or anyone under the age of 13, basically. So this is why it gets tricky. Let's say that you have an audience of 1 million and 1 million people watch your video. If one child under 13 expresses an interest to want to watch your video, from what I understand, the FTC means that you have to say that your video is likely to be watched by a child. And that means that you get your ad revenue, your targeted ad revenue taken away. So just to explain that, for all of you who watch the ads or get ads on the videos, you're getting ads based on what you use on your computer or your phone. Let's say you make a search for, a vacation to Canada. Well, if you do that search but don't book anything, and even if you do, you might get adverts for vacations, maybe to Canada, maybe to other places in the world. And that is in part what pays for me to be able to keep making content. But what the FTC want is, if there's a person under 13, they are not allowed to get those targeted ads. You're not allowed to track them, and you're not allowed to give them ads based on what they watch, because they're under 13 and you shouldn't be tracking them, which is completely understandable. So basically the FTC is saying that you have to tick a box to say this video might be watched by someone young, therefore don't give me trackable ads, which takes off about 60 to 90% of what you earn. So for a creator doing this as a full-time gig, it can really destroy your channel, which is a very big concern. Now, there's a petition going on. If you check out my Twitter, it's my latest tweet, and it would mean a lot to me and probably every creator you watch if you could sign it. Now, a lot of you might say, oh, Mort, well, you create horror stories, they're not for kids anyway. Well, yeah, you're right, but if a kid watches it, what then? Is it my fault that the kids watched it? It's very ambiguous right now. I'm still trying to understand it as best I can. I know Darkness Prevails is getting quite afraid by it based on his tweets and stuff. So yeah, it's got me in a tizzy, and I'm a bit worried. So yeah, I just hope this doesn't pass. I feel like every year something happens that's trying to kill YouTube. Or YouTube is trying to kill YouTubers. Everyone is just out to get us. It's not nice. It just feels like every time you calm down and think, YouTube isn't trying to kill off its creators by demonetizing their content. This is all good now. The media isn't trying to tear us down anymore. Now the FTC is trying to tear us down. Hooray for difficulties. It's just very hard. I'm sorry about the romp, but yeah, it's tough right now, and me and a whole bunch of other creators are quite scared, because if you mark your video as not suitable for kids under that age, and I suppose the FTC then reviews your video and says whether they believe that or not. So if they say, actually no, this isn't kid friendly, no, they think, this is kid friendly, then you get a $42,000 fine per video. And as a creator with over 880 videos, think how damaging that can be if the FTC turns to me and says, well, every video of yours can be watched by a kid, sort of kid friendly, so you're going to get a $42,000 fine for each video. That's insane money insane money, which I certainly don't have. I couldn't even pay one fine. So it's very, very scary. This is a real horror story, guys. Please check out my Twitter. Please sign the petition. I'll probably link it in the description as well. It's scary times, and I just hope this doesn't pass, because it would. And I hope YouTube are doing something, because if not, this could be the downfall of loads of YouTubers. It's not just me, it's loads of people as well. So yeah, I'll leave you with that crushing thought. Stay awesome, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.